Welcome to Varn blog. And today I'm going to talk about a recent trend I've noticed, almost to the point of making me think that there is some internal messaging about it, of the DSA to refer to Peter Camejo's 1970 article, Liberalism, Ultraleftism, or Mass Action, which was reappropriated in the Washington Socialist article by Brian W., the liberal to ultra-left pipeline, breaking the cycle. I will also be mentioning a recent article by Glenn Greenwald and a episode of The Dig with Femi Tawano, Mindy Iser, and Zachary Hirschman. And I will be talking about recent events with the Biden administration. For 7 years, I've had a joke that if we were honest about the content of Jacobin, we would call it Gerontian. And some days I would say we should even call it Orleanist. When reading the various pieces, Camejo, Brian W., and going back and rereading Lenin again, there's a couple things that strike me. One, some of the problems they're describing are totally real. The inability to have membership in organizations be, a goal. The lack of a cadre system, although in the dig discussion around this, which I've listened to about an hour of, they do have some very strong limitations on their view of how large, and how effective the cadre system was. It was not just the NGOification of the left that cut out the cadre system. It was also the professionalization of unions in the 1950s, the incorporation of unions into the state in Italy and Sweden and Scandinavia. All these things actually mirrored the NGOization. So that's not the only explanation of it either. But political morality, moral kitsch, and political aesthetics is a real problem on the left. But it is not a problem that you can contrapose it to, let's say, joining the DSA and finding your real cadre membership. Partly because the DSA is also not particularly structured to do things beyond local social activism, more or less, national policy advocacy within the Democratic Party. The appeals to Camejo and to Lenin in this invocation of the ultra-left to all the people who are radicalized via Twitter that are causing a problem for the DSA is interesting to me, because Camejo first was interested in unity between Trotskyists and Maoists, and then was a major figure in founding the Green Party. He did not think bourgeois parties could be part of the praxis of his revolutionary organization. And I say this because I've studied Peter Camejo a lot, not because my politics are Peter Camejo in. In fact, he would probably call me somewhere between an ultra-leftist and something else he didn't like. But because I wrote for a magazine that was inspired by Peter Camejo's project. It was called The North Star. I wrote for it for years. I only wrote like 3 articles for it, but I was also one of its main editors during that time period when Ben Campbell and Van Bean resigned. So I know Camejo pretty well, considering I was tasked with editing a magazine named after his legacy. Now, so the DSA would not really be doing the kind of thing Camejo was talking about. And also, as I like to remind people, and I brought this up, I believe, in a recent Pop the Left episode that's only available to patrons, but this point needs to be stated. The DSA is about a fourth of the size, maybe a fifth of the size of every estimate. Um, the DSA is about a fourth or a fifth of the size of every estimate of the 1910s um, cadre membership of the SPA, and it has never. I mean, it does not have the, I don't know, 20% of the vote that the SPA could command, leading up to the 1918 election. The CPUSA was also similarly large to the to the SPA, but never tried to field its own candidates. It considered during the third period time, it considered itself premature to do so. After 1936, it was part of the Popular Front, so it supported the Democrats. The purpose of an organization, as stated by the people on Dig podcast, though, is to skill you in how to start developing your own way out of capital. It is not just to get you to read Marx. I mean, yes, that's a good point. Although, how many people actually read Marx with any sense of coherence, reading it in its proper context, learning everything you need to learn, that's a different question entirely. And one that's actually important. As I often tell some people, knowing a little bit of something and knowing it poorly is often worse than knowing nothing at all. But I'll flash this up. It took 10 years. The SPA did it in 10 years based off the back of union organizations, um, and at a time when most of that organization was borderline illegal. So there's no excuse for the DSA. The DSA has existed for 30 years. So, you know, the DSA actually hit very quickly in opposition to Reagan, actually hit what is normally the natural limit of a left sectarian group in America, which is about 5,000 people. It then slipped down about 1,000 and remained there for 25 years ish. Until no, maybe longer than that, 35 years. Its expansion was due to Bhaskar Sankara picking it with Jacobin and Bernie Sanders' relationship to it. So I'm actually not a Democratic centralist, although I do think you must have a programmatic line. The reason why I'm against Democratic centralism is the way it's. I mean, if you have an actual Democratic organization, it will be effectively dim cent anyway. The suppression of dissenting voices tends to make an organization weak, and also tends to actually to more fractious behavior. All you have to do to learn that is look at how many dim cent organizations have split, particularly when they ban internal factioning and Bolshevize their party. It's a good essay on programmatic unity. Maybe I should write it. The other thing, though, an organization is supposed to do is to help you build dual power relationships. So to teach you how to run the things that are run by the state that is suppressing you yourself. And there have been programs that local DSAs have done that do this. This is definitely a point of what the Panthers program was. Here's the thing, though. You guys would probably ask me to publish it at a place like Jacobin, and I won't do that. One, I'm aphasic. Writing anything other than poetry, writing anything long, grad school was really rough for me. Even though I was in grad school for, like, I don't know, a long time. I mean, I graduated early, but I was in grad school for 3 years. I was in uni for like 8, while I was working, and papers were a nightmare. Not because I have trouble writing, but because I don't see what I write because I'm a phasic. That's why I co-write all my books. I might actually write an essay on programmatic unity based on what things that don't come up in Christopher Lasch. So it might be in the Lasch book. If not, maybe in the book PH and I are talking about on operaismo, autonomia, and its application to the modern left. There would be one of the things I think is important from workers' inquiry is if you do workers' inquiry, you need to have an immediate demands to assuage workers' needs, not just to build a political center. But also you need very strongly some kind of overarching program to which those needs are going to be building towards. Now, who's a liberal? I've called the central trend of the DSA liberal for a long, long time. Video essay with the Alphabematic, what I do in a PowerPoint. I'll be doing that tomorrow morning, peeps. Or tomorrow afternoon. So I read the Liberalism to Ultraleftism, Breaking the Cycle, and I agreed with one point in it, and the rest of it I thought was pernicious. The one point I agree with, though, is moral kitsch substituting for any political action. And that, moral kitsch is great for selling Lenin is a total liberal. Yeah. Okay. Have you got your information on Lenin from Lars Lee? Yeah, that's what most people get it from. So, if we ask ourselves what's the ultra left problem, I don't think moral kitsch is solely a problem of the ultra left. The SLP doesn't actually end up being that important. The Working Man's Party is. The Populist Party is hugely important. That's going to be a bit. I'm actually writing this essay in the Lasch book right now because this is the focus of Lasch. This is the focus of Lasch's first 3 books is the early 20th century development of the left in the United States. There's some other books that I could tell you to read. Unfortunately, most of the histories of the left either start with the new left or they, jump from international to international. I've been reading a lot more on the First International and on the SPA, a lot more. Unfortunately, the scholar of that I know on the CPUSA that wrote his dissertation on it, and I get on Twitter fights too much for me to for me to safely cite his work. But if you want to look it up and make your own decision, that'd be Joshua Morris. There's other scholars on the CPUSA too. What I would say is that the moral kitsch issue is not just a problem of social media, nor is it just a problem of the NGOization, as I was saying very early on. Um, However, what I found interesting is there is a way in which each one of the essays mentioned left-wing communism and infantile disorder. By the way, like I consider myself a post-Leninist heading towards the Panakuk tradition of councilism. Um, There is. I was about to say that the new left, all the things we see on Twitter are exaggerated versions of things that Kameho was talking about. But, and this is a big but, Kameho couldn't get out of it because he wanted to unify the same left, which mostly college students, who then, after they left the colleges in the 70s, tried to, go into the factories or whatever. And it was both a waste of an education, frankly, and um, was ultimately unsuccessful because they couldn't deal with the structure of unions under Taft-Hartley. Panakuk, look up at Anton Panakuk, or as he's sometimes called in Twitter circles, Tony Pancakes. Um, so the two streams of left communism are the Dutch stream, which was councilist, and the Bordiga stream, which is kind of a footnote, who are like ultra Leninist. Um, so Leninist that Lenin didn't recognize them. Councilism does come out of a strain of Luxemburgism, but it's sort of its own thing. But it's different than the syndicalist Marxists because they under the councilists understood that society is reproduced, not just the work site. So, syndicalist, having syndicalist unions and competition would replicate a lot of the problems that we have in capital now. So why am I responding? I'm actually probably going to have a friend of mine come on air and talk about it once he's available. My friend Jeremy, who American SVP mandated cadres get jobs in mines and factories and such. Didn't yeah, I know. The SWP did. The RCP tried to. The US RCP, not the UK one. You know, I've been thinking about the revolutionary subject for a long time. The revolutionary subject should be the proletariat, and who the proletariat is a little bit not often. I don't think they're interacting with real socialism now. What does that mean? I mean, like, I don't know. I tend to think axiomatic definitions of things like socialism are against A, the spirit of Marx, and B, don't tend to work. You would talk to my friend Chris Nejek from Regrettable Century about Yugoslavia. Oh, let me get Jeremy on. So, I think Yugoslavia has many, many flaws and ended up having some pretty strong ran into similar issues as the Khrushchevites did, but I do think that it was at least trying. I mean, honestly, I'd even say like Chavismo, where the workers' councils really did, particularly under Chavez, less so under Maduro, really did have an effect. The problem with Chavismo was not its total political structure, although its degeneration into left Bonapartism, and I would even maybe say quasi left Bonapartism, is not surprising. But its dependence on one commodity on the capitalist market kind of doomed it from the get-go. It meant that it had to peg its currency. This is one of the things that the MMTers will try to sell you, not totally inaccurately, that if Chavismo had currency sovereignty, it would be able to get out of the situation that it was in, but it doesn't have currency sovereignty because it's dependent on the production of one major commodity, that is oil. Hey, it's Jeremy.
Hey, how you doing? There we go. Now my face fits. There we go.
Yeah, I always have trouble with the face fit too. My head is large.
Likewise.
My head is large for metaphorical as well as literal reasons. So Jeremy and I know each other. We've even hung out in person.
Was that 2018 or 2019?
It was 2018. It was my first year back in the United States, back before COVID put 20 pounds back on me and all that fun stuff. So
what do you think? Why do you think they call it the COVID-19? I need my podcaster soundboard sound effects here. Anyway.
All right. So Jeremy is a host of giving the wrong person the mic.
Giving the mic to the wrong person.
Yeah. Use the wrong.
Giving the mic. Facebook.com/giving the mic.
And he's a member of an organization that I like to talk a lot of shit about. And about, I think 3/4 of the time you half agree with me. So, but I won't out you. I won't out you on what parts you agree and don't agree with me on. I know you don't particularly agree that I should put the leadership of the DSA against the wall, but and would not admit that in public.
I wouldn't admit that in public. I mean, it's the thing. It's very much the same kind of sense of like, hey, they can't do that to our pledges. Only we can do that to our pledges. It's like,
right.
Hey, wait a minute. Only DSA members can insult DSA National.
Right. Let me explain that. Some people don't know my stance to DSA, which I have a formal stance on. I will support the DSA in any action. I will do DSA educational trainings. I will write for DSA publications, except for Jacobin. I will, I have general long-standing. In fact, at Salt Lake DSA, I was asked at one point to come on and help their education committee, and I was like, I don't think you want me to do that. And they responded, why? And I was like, they would overthrow you if I did that.
God only wonders what you was saying. You're the one who actually deals with high school students all the time too. I was say,
yeah.
What are you teaching in those classes of yours?
So that's actually come up a lot. People think that I am always people on the left always think I'm like programming kids or believe in social, like I do believe in social justice education, and in so much that I believe that a proper education is helpful, and that systemic disadvantages should be dealt with in a public school. But I will also say that I can't think of anything more uncool than a teacher trying to indoctrinate me, and I don't.
Yeah. Well, it's not like you have the ponytail and like a leather jacket, and you kind of you turn the chair around to rap with the bros, rap with the buds.
Have internet trolls tried to cancel fire me, Varn? Internet trolls have tried to cancel me many times. There has never been anyone who's complained to my job. And if they did, a public school would laugh at them. I've had parents threaten me, but not for my political post on Facebook. It's been for other random stuff. Usually, so them thinking someone in my department was trying to program it, and they always wanted, like, what was it that we were accused of? We had Diary of the Part-Time Indian on the reading list, and we were accused of teaching the kids porn. I think that was the only time my parents really tried to go after me, and it was on the school reading list. So yeah, that won't work. So now, however, I will say the gentle application of Stockholm syndrome will build loyal cadres, but and I learned that from being a teacher. But yeah, you there?
Oh, I'm sorry. Right. No, I was just saying it's the. I know I'm just having flashbacks to. God, I think wasn't it like the hip young lady teacher at the beginning of. Oh God, what was Richard Linklater's film set in the mid 70s?
Oh,
Post-Slacker.
Dazed and Confused. Dazed and Confused.
Yeah, the teacher who's like, everybody enjoy your summer, and it's kind of like, the hep teacher talk about, celebrate how the founding fathers didn't want to, didn't want to pay their taxes, or something like that.
Yeah. So you had me listen to the Dig podcast, which my initial response was skepticism, then anger, then engagement, and in rapid succession. Yeah, mostly because I've heard DSAers call me an ultra leftist for many years, and I've always found those funny. So
odd. I was gonna say, yeah, it got you angry enough that you sent me multiple Facebook voice messages.
Yes. Okay, I want you guys to look at my hand versus the size of this thing. Like, I don't like typing on a phone. But I found, when I actually listened to it, I found their analysis of a lot of the problem interesting. But I also found that, like, and I was talking about this before you came on, that what they're calling ultra leftism is actually different than what historically has been called ultra leftism. Although it's partly because until I listened to that show, no one even tries to define it. Like, it's, what is it that the Brian W. article says, that you know it when you see it, and I'm like, I don't know what you do, actually. So but I do see, I think it was either Femi Tawano or Zachary Hirsch, blah blah blah, Hirschman, who said that it's a disconnection with your politics from your social base, which I find interesting because if you think about that, it's the opposite problem of tailism, right? So tailism is when you just deliver what your social base wants, a la populism. And ultra leftism, the way Femi defined it, is total disconnection from your base. Or the way Hirschman defines it is total disconnection from your base. Then Hirschman gave this story of the high period of labor organizations with the educated political cadres or whatever, which I liked, but realized that they were idealizing the past, because I've read enough of the history of this to know that the high point of educational cadres, who were active in labor movements and social organizations, who were not super specialized or subsumed to the state in almost any area, is like 15 years. Like, it's a very small period of time. And he was talking about generations of of accumulated experience, and I was like, you need to actually study your left history better, because like, no, that's not what I've read, and that's not what I've experienced. Like, frankly, in left years, you and I are ancient, because we're a non-68er who's still a leftist after 10 years, and that's rare.
Yeah, I was gonna say I consider myself a not a stereo. Well, let's just say, while I am a cishet white male, college educated, in a technical job, and I host a leftist podcast, have facial hair and spectacles. I am a Gen Xer, not a millennial. So screw you, stereotypes.
Yeah,
But
I'm a Zennial, I guess. Or I don't know. Every time I look at when they define Gen X, it moves.
Yeah.
So like, on the original definition of 82, 83, I am clearly like a baby Gen Xer. But on the sometimes I see millennials defined as early as 79, and so I'm like, I don't know. I remember the Cold War, and I had I had the internet at a library in high school. So
right there, thus the one use of the as some people call it, the Oregon Trail generation.
yeah,
I will say, I think one of the reasons why generational terms, like what, or even like let's call them cohort names, get slippery, is it's pretty much
it's a marketing term, isn't it?
I was gonna say, yeah, no, it literally is the two guys who came up with the term millennial. I can't remember what's his face and what's his face were marketing execs. And best thing of all, one of the two of the guys who came up with that term, who recently passed, co-founded the Capitol Steps. So, which should tell you something. But one thing I would say is, oh, hi, Ben. That I should say is, I think one of the reasons why it gets slippery is that pretty much because target market, as Homer Simpson once said, I'm a white male, aged 18 to 39. Everyone wants to hear what I say. It's pretty much as long, whatever name they can use for the cohort who is in that age range at the present moment, and then it will change. One question I did want to ask, is we mentioned, and some people are even asking about, like, talking about left history on the chat. Can you give a description or an explanation of the evolving definition, or I guess even connotation, of ultra left from, say, 1905 through through the new left until now?
So ultra left originally was a position of either absolute electoral abstentionism. So that included the left communist, the syndicalist, and the anarchist. So they just wouldn't participate in elections at all, because they figured that the only thing that would matter would be an insurrection directly.
This is
The
very,
way it,
very pre-World War I thinking.
right. In the from the 30s to the 90s, it was a harder thing to deal with, because ultra left could be applied to anyone who was critiquing either the USSR, actually, because it would even be thrown at Maoist a lot. At least Maoist in the West, and to be fair, Maoist groups in France actually did take positions historically aligned with the ultra left. In addition to that, there's increasingly a abstentionist from organizations attitude that gets associated with the ultra left, I think.
Really? So it's even more like we're just in here for the hardcore scene,
right?
We're keeping our scene pure,
right? That I think that's like, when I don't use the term ultra much because it's so often thrown at me, but who I would consider an ultra leftist would be a person who would say not work with unions, someone who would not work with an NGO on an action. Someone who would abstain from any kind of cooperation with a group they didn't like. So for example, there are groups that I won't work with, not just right-wing ones, but that list is actually really thin. A lot of what I see now, though, I mean, I've seen positions called ultra left currently that are historical first and second international positions. So, for example, do not join a bourgeois party. Now, that in America does mean something different than in any parliamentary system, all right, which is something I think we do have to admit. And also, like, what does it mean to join a party in the United States? I filled out a voter registration form. Like, I don't pay anything to the Democrats. I don't, so there's that.
Yeah, I was a precinct committee person for a little bit in the local county Democrats, just to act as kind of like a flank protection for the two candidates that Portland DSA ran in for Democratic seats. But when both of those primaries didn't go too well, I kind of resigned after that. So. But for example, being voted that. That's the other thing. It's like side note to that, it's like, and one of the things that I myself did not really realize until like reading that George Lightham Short History of Socialism book was that when so much of kind of like the core, what is considered like, I don't know, like the golden age of like leftist European writing, when they're, it's all, from like what 1910 through, which is like 1900 through like World War I or 1920. The thing I never really realized is that, in so many of these countries, like mass suffrage was not a thing up until extremely recently.
Yeah, mass suffrage was achieved in some of those areas as late as the 1930s and 40s. And they also thought, actually, I mean, to be fair, like Ingalls goes back and forth on this, but Kautsky thought for sure that full enfranchisement of the working class would lead to relatively bloodless revolutions. I say relatively because even Kautsky thought they'd have to have an armed defensive revolution, like, what do you say, a counter revolution, like. But I think only Bernstein was the person who thought you could just develop capital your way out of it. But yeah, it's a very short period of time. It's the parties are, and it's also something interesting when we talk about political parties now, because I made this point with Doug Lane many times, but like, a political party in Europe in like the 1900s is a much more involved thing than a political party in the United States, or a political party in the UK. And so, yeah, I mean, basically, Ingalls thought that was the case, but that you could take over by democratic force first, and the bourgeoisie would attack, and you'd have to be ready to defend yourself.
Stuff, yeah.
So there's a wide spectrum of ultra left positions. When I read a lot of the stuff coming out of the polemics coming out of DSA about this right now, I don't know exactly who they're talking about, except annoying people on Twitter. But annoying people on Twitter don't matter.
Yeah.
So, like, it's an interesting problem. And it's one that's only going to get worse because the incentives. I think that what I didn't hear in that, and that may be because I told you I only listened to the first hour before I went on air because I have a window today. So, but I didn't hear them talk about the fact that, the initial progressive impetus that you saw, it looked like you saw in the Abai administration, is drying up really, really fast. It honestly, what I will say is the Biden administration out the gate was more progressive than I was expecting it to be, but almost immediately has gone to what I thought that it would be, which is, for example, just today I was reading they're not expanding the asylum numbers. They are Biden's actually overseen an acceleration of selling military equipment to local police. Biden has, there's the Democrats are beginning to run inflation narratives that make me worried. Not because inflation isn't going to be a problem, but because they're going to blame it on a $1,200 check and not on, I don't know, a year and a half of unlimited QE, exploding stock assets. Yeah.
Quantitative easing for those of you without your syllabus.
Yeah, quantitative easing. Yeah, Jeremy makes sure that I don't talk over people's head, which is probably good since I don't normally care if people understand me.
Real quick, but we'll back just to finish up on the ultra thing.
Mm-hmm.
So we went up through the 90s. So in the last, so how or does that definition roughly work in like the last, I don't know, 5 years or 5 to 20 years?
Well, if the definition is what was actually posited by Hirschman on that Dig episode, that your tactics do not align with your social base, I would actually say that it applies to everybody on the left, including the people complaining about the ultra left, because the social base in which they're interested in, outside of some very specific cities, they don't have much purchase with. They do have purchase with it in Brooklyn. They do have purchase with it in Portland. They do have purchase with it in Seattle to some degree. I hate to sound like Ross Dunhat, but that does seem to be a function of extreme wealth inequity in wealthy places, whereas reaching out to actually more working class, even working class cities like, say, Pittsburgh is not, or New Orleans, has not been as effective. And what we also see in those areas is the DSA itself would take on traits that would be seen as by other DSAers as ultra left not for the DSA in, for example, New Orleans is far more radical than the DSA in Brooklyn, and it's actually because it's the only game in town, so there's no other organizations for people to join. I think I'm a little worried that some of this attack on the ultra left right now from the DSA is to cover for the frustrations of post 2020 Bernie and post 2020 most of the squad, not all of it, but definitely AOC. So
I had never really thought of this being as some sort of like post squad thing. I always figured that so much of the uptick of inline fighting over the last almost year was, I think, just a lot of the Bernie campaign kind of crumbling, but also a lot of folks getting caught, I don't know, flat-foot or something by the uprising, and then that's why you had like a lot of people taking it out online. And I think this is one of the things that I don't think one of the benefits of being an older online person is that because you've been, we have been around online for more than a decade or two, or three in my case, is that you
2.5 on mine.
Yeah, is the got my first 2400 baud modem when I was in junior high and never looked back. Oh boy, but just realizing that expression online versus expression in real life are like two entirely different things. And it's like the non-hyperbolic expression isn't, thanks to how social media feeds and the algo is deliberately tuned to the kind of like, because not to coerce you, but to enable you to feed that content mill and just spout off the dumbest shit possible, which means you can't you can't build anything off that. I think it's one of the things that Crispin always says is that we have to build anything. It's one of the first steps to do is just to log off, because these systems that are built cannot be generative.
Right. Well, I won't say with who because I want to respect their anonymity, but I had a conversation with a podcaster friend of mine, and I will say it's not Ben Burgess since he's in the chat and people might assume it's him. And I was saying a lot of the political podcasts right now have lost their way because these people only do podcasts, and the person responded to me like, but they're doing just as well as before Trump. And I'm like, on their Patreons, sure. But what's the message? What are they building towards? What are we arguing about? Like, it's all over the place now, even when it's some of the same people. And it's okay to be lost, right? Yeah. But the Twitterverse is a good way to get completely lost. Like, one of the things I've tried to do on Varn blog that I haven't done in other incarnations of what I do is actually talk about stuff like the pain in the assness of actually being in a crappy union, and what do you got? What do you want to do about that? Or like how as an activist you're almost never not influenced somewhere by NGOs, even when you're doing mutual aid work. Yeah. Or yeah, I mean, like you have to actually engage with that in a very real way to critique it. Like, I have strong critiques of the American labor movement as it exists, other than the fact it's small. But if you're not in a union, and a lot of people can't be, so like, this is another thing. Like, there's systemic things that aren't being dealt with. I will give that Dig podcast credit for this, because they did admit some of this has to do with things that's not about personal attitude. Another thing that I like to call it the moral Hitch problem. It's something Esri XB and I started using on Mortal Science, but like an overinflated sense of moral aesthetics.
Did you say the kitsch problem or the
the moral kitsch?
Moral kitsch. Okay.
So you have a moral aesthetic. All right. Like, let's say that aesthetic is like, I don't know, 1920 Soviet Union propaganda and working class kitsch. Okay.
The Jordan B. Peterson collection, in other words.
Yeah. Right.
Oh, side note, real quick. I just the local art museum. Not only because I looked at their upcoming schedule. They delayed the Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera, kind of like socialist realism or social realism, like mural exhibit till next year. The exhibit immediately after that is Soviet propaganda from 1917 to 1939. So I thought that was an amusing, like, 1-2 punch.
Yeah, that's funny. So I think there are people trying to honestly deal with the post-Bernie moment. During the Bernie period, I like to call myself. I still like to call myself Dark Ben Burgess. Because I was never as optimistic about it as you guys were, and I also didn't really want to gloat when what I thought was going to happen more or less happened. And Bernie losing wasn't what I thought was going to happen. It was capitulating that I thought was going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say it was a shock to some of us who had made the trek out to to the primary states like Nevada and such to put in the steps.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was one of the things that I did find interesting is the West responded differently than the South did. And But I mean, I also would, even if Bernie had gotten further, the we're already seeing now the apparatus of the Democratic Party is still stronger than we realize, even though on the state level, it's like massively underfunded. Like I know people who work like in the for the Democratic Party. Yes, I have friends that work for the Democratic Party, and I haven't tried to firebomb their house. That work for the Democratic Party in like Florida, and they're telling me their resources, and I'm like, I've worked for left groups that that barely had less resources than that. Wow. But at the national level, I mean, actually, it does seem like the entirety of the Democratic Party resources has been focused on the national level to such a point it's actually stratified its local level. So that's also happening in left stuff altogether. And one of the things I was pushing back on people with Bernie is like, you have to build these institutions, not just in terms of money, to fight this. And I don't really know how you're going to do it easily. Our big defeat this week was Bama, and
that sucked.
It sucked. I was optimistic for a little while, and I don't usually let myself get optimistic, but what I was afraid of happened because it was one site in the South. The workers were going to vote against it, not because they didn't want a union. We don't know. Some of them probably didn't. Some of them probably scabby. Who knows? But because they know that plant or that distribution center, excuse me, can be shut down very easily unless there are other unionizations that happen very rapidly around the country. So and Taft-Hartley makes that really hard to do. And that's like the catch-22. And when I talk about like the prevalence of ultralism in the, if you want to talk about ultralism in the United States, like if you want to, and by this I mean like in contemporary stuff. I don't mean like what your vision of communism is. Like Ben Burgess might call my vision of communism slightly ultra. In fact, I know he would. Slightly ultra lefty. But like how you even get there, I get why so many people go towards the absolute, because the reforms are those seem so far off too, even though we know they're possible.
Yeah. But earlier, going back to the point you made about like having having vlogs about life, actual real life in an actual real life union. A good friend of mine, I don't think I've ever had the two of you on the same episode that I've done, but is an educator union organizer up in Washington State.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it sometimes gets exasperated because there are no pop culture representations, or at least no popular ones, of what like contract bargaining really is like.
And no, yeah,
they would kill if somebody could, I don't know, somebody, hey, folks in the audience, crowdfund some money for Boots Riley to make a movie about this, but just to have just an example of or depiction of it, just so people have like a basic framework of what it's actually like, because it's like it's a central part of union life, but because it's one of those no shortcuts things, the slog you got to do to make it work, it doesn't it's like no one most people, unless they are directly involved, which is relative handful, is really aware of it and or prepared for it, I guess.
So
also we had a question in the chat of if the demand for is police abolition an ultra demand or an ultra stance right now.
So I would say police abolition in the context of the abolition of capital is not an ultra transitional goal. Police abolition in its own context, without other reforms throughout the system, is totally ultra. So this is why I don't like you also using ultra left, because it's very positional to to a bunch of different things. It's positional to where the left is and where the social base is at your time you're talking about. It's positional to not just the position that you're taking, but the context of the position that you're taking. So if I'm taking an abolition, like, yeah, of course I'm a police abolitionist. But I'm also a person who's like, if you just abolish the police right now and left everything else the same, it would be a goddamn nightmare.
Yeah.
Um,
Jason Mouse from This Is Revolution, a YouTube show that everybody should subscribe to right now, and they'll be on the air tomorrow, has very strong opinions about this too, due to his own day-to-day work among houseless populations and other stuff in Oakland.
Yeah, it's very similar to my position on regards to like U.S. imperialism, like. You draw down and leave, and you do things to repair the damage that you did. But if you just up and leave overnight without doing anything, it's just going to be a civil war in the aftermath.
Right.
And I've been, it's one of the weird times where I've been called a right deviationist for that by people who most of the time would have a position to the right of me. But it's just like, I just think it's like, having lived in other countries where I've seen political vacuums and also like people swoop in for their own agenda after a hegemon leaves. Like, if you just pull out unilaterally and don't do anything to rebuild, and hand over local autonomy, it's almost as worse as staying there as it is. Like, you have to do something. And one of the things I've been harping on lately, is that the left view of foreign policy is often non-existent, and when it is existent, it's naive, either about the way power works in a vacuum, or in the way that other nations might be what they're actually interested in too. So, yeah. And so like that's a super bad thing. And there's reasons why, for example, I mean, like, I think there's geopolitical reasons why we're leaving Afghanistan that aren't even totally about like, U.S. troop forces, like knowing that tensions between us and China are likely to continue to go up, and the Democrats don't seem to be willing or know how to de-escalate that situation.
Some of them want to bring it on, yeah.
Yeah, so we need just transition framework. Just transition framework should be used for a lot of things, and these are things that, like, I don't think it's this is why, like, I might joke that I'm an ultra in the sheets, but I don't know, whatever you guys are, socialist in the streets, because at the end of the day, like, I still think, I think accelerationism is another example of a modern ultra position that was very rare historically. And that is, let capital get as worse as it can, so that the immiseration will prompt revolution, even though there's no historical evidence for that ever happening. There are letters that indicated Marx did believe that was a possibility in the 1850s, but like, he clearly didn't by the time he entered the First International. And not to mention, like, even if Marx did think it, we have 100 years of counter evidence. So,
yeah.
But so these are my things. These are my big things right now. I think the problem that the DSA has, and why some DSAers consider me an ultra, is I don't know, because it lacks a program, it's beginning to develop a program, and I'm hearing people talk about it. But I also know every time I hear someone talk about a program in the DSA, they are immediately afraid of massive splits. And that's because the DSA was set up by Harrington deliberately to be kind of confederated in a way that it wasn't really a power base. The power base would still be the Democratic Party. Like, that's why it was set up differently than its sister and competitor organization, the SPUSA. Because effectively, after Shachtman enters and then kind of kills the SPA in its moribund 60s form, Harrington, like, goes into the Democrats, works with the McGovern campaign. You can listen to my friend Doug Green talk about this, although he's a rabid anti-Harringtonite. So just know that. Shachtman actually gets closer and closer to neoconservatism after the 60s because he's so concerned about fighting communist influence on the American left. And the remainder of the SPA forms the SPUSA in response to it and vows not to work with Democrats and to run their own candidates. And the SPA for a long time was probably the larger group, but it didn't have as many famous people in it. So do with that what you will.
Right.
Yeah. I bring all that up because right now it seems like there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in caucuses and locals and the DSA. I actually will completely give people credit for that. And the DSA has become something of a sectarian organizational clearinghouse. So the sects have liquidated, but they now mostly still recapitulate themselves as factions within the DSA, which is actually, if you wanted a broad-based left movement, what you'd want. I mean, ideally, if it was more of a class organ, you'd have even more different kinds of groups represented within one organization.
For example, in terms of the different kinds of groups,
you'd have trade unionists, you'd have feminist issue groups, you'd have advocacy groups within the party. You'd have different views of what socialism and communism is. There'd be an MMT faction. There'd be there might even be a communization faction. I think there is actually, which is weird. You'd have Maoists who are open to Popular Front reformism. You have various Trots groups probably who are already tendencies who don't, you'd have and all those things currently exist in the DSA, but they don't have an effect on what the National does hardly at all, at all. And the National is effectively like one caucus and the National itself. And that's kind of a problem because the closer you get up to the National, the more you are likely to view your primary work as trying to radicalize the Democratic Party. But with what social base are you going to do that? Greenpoint?
Yeah. A quick question. We have a jargon definition request for communization from the chat.
All right, communization is it is an ultra left position. Communization is a theory that the workers' movement reached its limit in the 1980s for whatever reason. There's several different reasons within it. So you can look up Duvet or Endnotes or Tikkun is the anarchist version of it. And that you need to create affinity groups. This is actually very similar to New Left positions, weirdly. Affinity groups to respond and help prefigure communism when either collapse or crisis happens. So, yeah. Gilles Duvet, Theory Communiste, Endnotes, Tikkun. These are the groups. They're kind of everyman form of it would be Anti and Antifada. Catastrophism in general. I tend to think catastrophes tend to be slower than they realize. Yes, a state can fall apart, but the catastrophe of the Soviet Union was it happened over 40 years. It was arguably you could say that the catastrophe of the Soviet Union began in 1921 and just didn't stop. are, and some people, myself included, think the catastrophe of the Soviet Union was like 1919 because the German Revolution didn't happen the way it was supposed to happen, etc. So building a cadre, that sounds like what I said. Okay, so cadre stuff is kind of a problem, and I say it's kind of a problem because there's one sense in which you need it and another sense in which it's a hindrance. So the sense in which you need a cadre is that you need people who have skills developed to impart those skills to other people, both politically and ideally to like replicate other parts of the social functioning. If I don't know, in a conflict with in a democratic or revolutionary conflict with the state, those systems fell apart. So you do need that, but what cadre has come to more or less mean is sectarian members of a sectarian group, not people who are skilled in anything. And that was something that when I was listening to the Dig podcast on this, that I was like, you're really not talking about why the cadre model soured before NGOization happened. It just got worse during that, but like there were problems with that as early as the 60s. The example that I can always give, and I don't love the new communist movement, but the new communist movement of the 60s was like 5 times to 6 times the size of the current DSA, but it was divided over about 25 different democratic centralist groups, and they didn't work together. And so,
of course,
yeah, and so like you had at the time what was probably in America the largest group of people in communist and socialist organizations was actually probably in the 60s. But they were so diffuse and into cadre models that wouldn't operate together, that they basically went nowhere. Add to that the kind of actionism of like particularly the weathermen, and the people who were engaged in the quasi-terrorist campaigns in the late 60s, early 70s. And I say quasi-terrorist because they weren't killing people, but they were blowing a lot of shit up.
Themselves,
yeah, they killed more themselves than anybody else. So
I did always find it amusing that the big meeting, the big like declaration that they made that they were going to go underground in December 1969 happened in my hometown of Flint, Michigan, about maybe 3 miles from where I grew up, at a building that no longer exists.
Yep. Yeah. So what skills do cadres develop? Well, it depends on the kind of cadre, actually. So this is another thing. Cadre is just a blanket term for people who are devoted to the party. So that like your cadres would be educated. Like if you had a militia, your militia cadres know military tactics, can teach people how to shoot, know first aid, can do field medicine. If you had organizational cadres that can teach people how to organize, teach people, medical cadres can do simple medical procedures, are trained to do it, and are trained to train other people to do it. Now, what cadre ended up became, because the primary focus was organizing, it just became kind of self-replicating. Like it kind of became like missionaries. Like it became like socialist missionaries, right? Like you just want to get more cadres. We would joke about it in the Emancipation Network as a primitive accumulation of cadres.
Yeah. So not just a member. Well, the difference between a cadre and a member was a cadre was more than just a skilled member, but a skilled member with with more than an average amount of like proselytization built in.
Yeah, so it's a skilled member or more than average amount of loyalty built in. So the idea originally was like if you're a good party member and you provide these things, people will want to join the party because you can provide these things. And I think what happened in the Popular Front period, honestly, I was about to say it's a new left, but it happened before then, was that the focus was more on just getting people in, getting them loyal to the line, which was whatever, the Soviet Union was doing, and then having them do stuff. Now, I was complaining about Josh Morris before you come on. He's not one of my favorite people in the world, but he actually does do some interesting scholarship about how locally the CPUSA people were not actually on the Moscow line, but on the national level they were. And that was a real issue, actually, particularly in the transition from pre-1936 to post-1936 CPUSA, because in the pre-1936 CPUSA, they didn't work with Democrats, and they were really big on building like Black Power organizations. They didn't call them that, but like W.E.B. Du Bois comes in this time period. All that stuff is around the CPUSA, and then I have to pivot in after 1936 to both advocate for civil rights and Black emancipation while being in a popular front with a segregationist party. And so a lot of the stuff they were doing prior to 1936 at the local level started to dry up.
Why do you think that is? Just national forces, or just?
Well, it's very hard to like hold a radical line locally and then be like, vote for FDR.
Oh, yeah.
And later on Truman, and then later on proto neoliberalizing Kennedy. But the CPUSA was able to send Lorraine Hansby to go talk to Robert Kennedy during the so they had a reason for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if I became a doctor in open clinic and if you taught other people how to do your skills.
Yeah. The self-replication is part of it.
Right. Equally ineffectual, German RAF seemed way more ridiculous and violent than the Weathermen. The European, just came up in my interview on Wednesday with P.H. Higgins about Apparismo, workerism in Italy, and they were also ended up being, during the days of lead, they ended up being pretty violent too. And it ended up, landing some people who were probably somewhat innocent leaders of that movement in prison for a while, and they ran to France, and the post-structuralists got them, and no good happened from that.
Yeah, I always wondered if it would be. It's like one of those under-focused things of like that, like leftists get into in terms of history. I think it might serve a lot of people. I don't know if it served them much, but at least definitely an object of study is having more people know exactly or talk about exactly like what the hell went on in Italy during the 70s. Because a whole lot of wild, especially like the PCI, the Italian Communist Party, there was a lot of wild shit happening in like that particular period alone.
Yeah, we were talking about that, like Apparismo, Operation Gladio. Operation Gladio is really hard to study because there's so much conspiracy theory bullshit around it, but like it's important. And the problem is with Operation Gladio is you have a real conspiracy that's very, very real and involves everyone from the mob to the Pope for real, and then you have people impugning on that. So you can see how crazy that would get.
Yeah. When your real world conspiracy is not enough to satisfy your conspiracism Jones, that you need to like go all David Icke and they're working together, and also they were lizards.
Right. The Man Half King got mixed up with Carlos Jackal. Once you get an actual subpatron leadership, you lost thread. Here's the problem with Carlos Jackal. Unfortunately, when you're trying to recruit people who are terrorists to your organization, and there was a lot of them back then, Carlos Jackal considered himself at first a dedicated leftist. Two things will likely happen. It's actually very similar to the history I gave about everyone, like when everyone's talking about like join your community self-defense league, and I'm like, well, you guys know what happened to community self-defense leagues when they don't get off the ground. They become gangs. Like,
I was gonna say militias, but yeah, that's close enough.
They become militias, which is fine. A militia is kind of the best possible outcome. So what you have, like, you think about what happened with the FARC, and the FARC has a very active revolutionary movement, but part of it's now just a narco trafficking or operation. You think about what happened with the Crips in LA. The Crips started off based off of the unification of what is it, the Royals, a bunch of gangs around the Black Panthers who they de-lumpenified in Black Panther parlance. The Crips tried to start basically a youth wing of that. And if you read Stanley Tookie Williams' autobiography, goes into this. but it backfires very quickly, and they start getting into narco trafficking to fund themselves, and the 80s gang situation happens. It's one of the things that I was like really mad at Adam. One of the many things I was mad at Adam Curtis for in the last documentary series is he like brought up Tupac, but didn't bring up the Crips. Now, and the way he presented Tupac was like borderline racist, frankly.
Really?
Yeah, me and Jason Miles were talking about it. Like the way he talked about gang culture in LA and what it came out of, and I mean, it is true, for example, that conspiracy theories were rife in gang culture, partly because of the unveiling of things like the Tuskegee experiment. Like, so
yeah,
yeah. So militia equals gang in rural area. Yeah. So it's good. It's interesting stuff to know. What does this have to do with who's calling who a liberal? You know, my stance is we're all liberals and we're all not liberals. Like, I know that sounds like a cop out, but like I used to. Ben Burgess can tell you. Esri can tell you. My wall used to be nothing but hatred of liberals, all the time, 100%. Liberals suck. Liberals, you know, and that's interesting because most people, I think, when their hatred of liberal comes out of like their rejection of their prior self. I don't think I've ever been a liberal. I come out of I think I'm a liberal in the way that everybody in America is a liberal because we all kind of are.
Yeah.
But
it's in the water.
Yeah. But and I don't even think that's a bad thing, actually, because your alternatives are like, I'm a Habsburgian monarchist.
Yeah. Big de Maesterite or something.
Right. But I am hey, Jason.
Cool,
Man, everybody's coming out today. This is the most other podcasters on this stream I've had. I should do more on Fridays, except I have a life.
It's pandemic, dude. Nobody has a life during pandemic.
Oh, I do. You know why I had to do it right now? My partner is in the jerk shed, which sounds gross, but she's actually doing her jerk cleans because she's a major weightlifter. And I say major, I mean she used to be semi-pro. Now she, hangs out in the backyard and throws weights around. And
so she's not like cooking like Jamaican chicken or something.
Yeah, no, she's not. I cook. Return to the ethnos. Oh boy. So, but I come out of this, this kind of reactionary, like reactionary left, and a lot of reactionaries really liked what I was saying about liberalism too much. They didn't understand what I was saying. Yes, I figured. And I also realized that everybody can call everyone else a liberal. Like when I was like the liberal to ultra left pipeline, I was like, well, who isn't a liberal? I mean, from my perspective, most of Jacobin, I know Ben's gonna think I'm being unfair, but most of Jacobin is at least strongly liberal adjacent. I can smell liberal on their breath.
Which is the worst? Yeah, which is the worst odor, patchouli or liberal?
Aren't they the same thing? Or is liberal more like Nag Champa?
I was to say if I lived in Ann Arbor for 10 years, and I think both of them were both of the odors were omnipresent. So
a liberal is a socialist without a spinal column. I wish they were socialist. I'd even take some namby-pamby Bernsteinian socialist. I guess that's what a lot of the DSA actually is.
Smells like a smoke shop in the 80s.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, this has become the revenge of the Gen X podcasters. If only
send Jason a link, get him on here.
If Jason wants on, I'll add him on. I'll add Ben on. I'll add anyone who wants to be on. You want to be on? Message me on Facebook, and I'll send you the link. And have up to 10 people on this thing.
Cool.
Yes, I read Joan Didion's profile of the Maoists and the communist left when I was a right winger, and then when I became a left winger, I still thought it was true. So like,
you can't come on. Jason has dad things to do.
Of course, he can listen with his kid, but he can't come on. That's fine.
Yeah. Well, I can one question that I can ask is that is somewhat around the topic is to prevent accusations of being an ultra and actual like ultraship. Where is a good stance to be? What is the modern equivalent of being? Was the old line like being one link in the chain ahead? Like, what is the as somebody once said, where is that, or what does that look like nowadays?
Being esoteric 12 or Varnist. No,
well, yeah, I mean, aside, like, that's the obvious answer. Yes, I mean,
but where should you be? What you should be right now? I think dual power would be important. A dual power strategy. If you're base building, you need to be base building for something clear, and you need to be able to give back to the people you're building a base of as much as you take. And that's actually a weirdly controversial position, but I used to point this out to IWW people. I'd be like, hey, IWW person, if you're going to compete with a business union, but you can't offer me insurance, what am I going to take?
Yeah.
Like right now, you're going to encourage dual cardism, and I would tell everybody, if you want a dual card with the IWW, good. In fact, in my ideal world, what happened with the DSA would have happened with the IWW, because it's closer historically to labor. In fact, that was what I was advocating for. Varnith Pascal synthesis in the works. That's what I was advocating for in 2012. Before the DSA exploded. When the DSA exploded, I had to take my hat and eat it, because I'm also a diehard anti-Harringtonite. So, well, okay. The thing is, though, that's going from 0 to 60 real fast, right? Like in a dual power autonomous zone.
Yeah, I think fast in their case. Yeah, Jason, see if Pascal is around. Talk to him. Shit, why
not? Yeah.
Just sorry for me randomly inviting people on your stream, but anyway, sorry. But anyway, yeah, back to you were talking about the IWW.
Okay, so
and the Chaz.
Yeah, the Chaz. Well, the Chaz was just you had a tiny zone. What exactly is dual cardism, dual unionism? Okay, dual cardism and dual unionism is when you think your union sucks, but you will not get represented in your workplace if you're not in it. You join another union at the same time. Dual unionism is legal. Dual cardism is legal. Dual unionism is legal. However, the IWW used to really encourage it and encourage political striking. And political striking is illegal, which is kind of how dual unionism kind of got crushed in the United States as an effective movement. It doesn't just happen with the IWW. For example, like in my school district, the AFT is the slightly more radical union, but it doesn't have enough members to do the contract negotiations. So if you're in the AFT will never ask you to leave the UEA, NEA, JEA, or whatever. I mean, what they will do is they will ask you to dual card, under the hopes that they'll eventually be able to represent you at your school. However, that's technically raiding, and unions frown on that.
How much is that a phenomenon of the dual in, say, most American grade school unions or something, if you will?
I think it's a phenomenon of the fact that for example, because the NEA wants to operate in states where unions are illegal, like Georgia, the NEA has actually transformed its culture to a slightly non-union culture. It calls itself an association. In certain states, it can't, like in Georgia, it can't bargain anyway. Where I used to live, so it has lobbying functions, and that has kind of pervasivized its culture. And the other thing that's happened is that more of its functioning is from non-teachers. So while the leadership is technically half elected from teachers and half professionals, and the professionals are technically subordinated to teachers, there's a whole lot of the actual staff and functioning of the union that is professional because it's devoted to lobbying. The ATF, actually, that is it. The ATF. I was like, is it the American Teachers Federation, or is it the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms? But the ATF, yeah, the ATF is actually a union. It's more affiliated with the AFL-CIO. It tends to locally. It tends to take better lines on elections. Which is still not good. It asks people to vote for conservative Democrats as opposed to moderate Republicans. So yeah. So I got a couple of other questions. How big do you think the DSA truly is? I think 100,000 paper members is probably accurate. I do sometimes wonder if it's like being in the LDS church and it's hard to get off the roll. I would also say that while that is the biggest left organization we have seen, it is now officially bigger than the left organization we have seen since the 60s. That's a big caveat.
Asterisk.
Yeah, asterisk. It is now officially bigger in absolute numbers than the SDS was, which I think was around 90,000. However, put it in comparison. At a time period when unions and left organizations were illegal, the First International had 800,000 at the low end and 2 million at the large end. Now, admittedly, that was divided over countries, but you also have to adjust for the population scale of 150 years ago. So, yeah. Take care.
Later.
They're watching Breaking Two on the stream. All right. So, historically speaking, when people tell me about the DSA and I complain about it, I will say it slightly hits above its weight because there are 10 million QAnoners out there. And there's probably more QAnon people in Congress than DSA people, but only slightly. So, I've never been a member of the DSA, just like I've never given money to Democrats directly. Those are my two pledges. The DSA active member is probably 1 to 7. Yeah, that's true for almost any organization. That's like what you got to adjust for. I will say, for example, there was 3,000 paper members for the DSA or something in here, and SLC, and I don't think they ever had more than maybe 100 to 200 show up to anything. But it's hard to say.
Those are not too far off of Portland numbers too. So
10 million. Well, yeah, there's 10 million people, but again, unlike the DSA, QAnon, I don't know, like you don't belong to an organization, so
you belong to one in your heart.
Yeah. So the ultra problem, and let's talk about the other thing I wanted to talk about today is I think in America we have a very strange issue right now, particularly in relation to the Democrats. I think the Democrats are figuring out the mood of the country in a way they can't continue the Clinton-Obama stop it, stop being so lefty, stop it. Yeah. But I also think they're figuring out a way to talk a game and not deliver shit. which is a actually kind of a new strategy because they're no longer shaming people for running left things; they're monobaling them. I don't know how many people in the U.S. left ever do anything other than online. Who knows? I mean, and again, 10 million is an upper estimate based off of chat relations.
One question. Well, actually, my question is, what is political striking?
Political striking is when you strike for a goal beyond wage or conditions at your job.
Okay.
And it's illegal under Taft-Hartley. It can cause you to lose your union charter by the Labor Relations Board.
So it's starting to get into the area of what they call social unionizing, almost like social unionizing.
Social unionizing. Although social unionizing is legal as long as you don't let anyone know you're doing it.
Yeah, related to, we had a question from Daniel Webster. Should unions in the South do more social unionizing?
Yes, if they're going to survive or spread at all. Particularly because in many states they're all but illegal in the public sector, and the public sector is going to be the place where it's easiest to unionize. People have asked me, why is that? Why is it easier for the public sector to unionize than the private sector? And that is because it's harder for the public sector to shut down stuff. Is the public sector going to shut down a community school if it unionizes? No. Their only option is to make it illegal. And they can only make public sector unions illegal. But if they do that and they're in a democratic state, they just killed their base. So why would they ever do that? However, I will say this: you have a problem with unions in democratic states too being actually, how do I say this? Lazy and basically becoming, fundraising mechanisms. What is a social union in this instance? A social union in this instance would be like if the IWW had massive interpenetration with both unions, or if the DSA did too. The DSA does have relations. What is it? The labor
working group.
Yeah, the labor working group does have relationships with the UE. As the UE is way larger than the DSA is, but and the scale of unions is still pretty small. And I always have to remind people, only 17% of wage earners in the United States are technically in unions. And most of that is either in nursing, teaching, or police. Which is why it's been hard to get the AFL-CIO to be consistent on police. Do I think Sinn Féin will someday lead a united Ireland? Well, it will be because Britain gives it to them if it does. Which they may do. It's because they're having real crises of stock in Northern Ireland because of Brexit. It's real bad. Yeah. 10K active members, so it's actually much less than that. When I tried to look up the UE membership, I got all kinds of weird numbers. So anyone I know is I also unfortunately hate to bring this up about unions, but unions have not become more popular in the United States because they become more popular from people in industries that are not unionized heavily, which is great. That has gone up dramatically. But old unions have had very little success becoming to getting people to join them.
Or
so
something like that?
Yeah, they're not being in general revitalized. They're still kind of sporadic. So what that tells you that even though people want unions, unions in one sense, I mean, I don't want to piss on unions and closed shop rules, but I will say closed shop rules made a lot of unions really not care if they appealed to their members, and that's a problem.
Yeah. Also, do you have any more suggestions on how to avoid the dreaded ultra tag nowadays, beyond just kind of because you mentioned dual power and a couple other things?
Well, I mean, someone's gonna call you an ultra, like,
It's
like,
like on the
uh,
internet.
yeah, like. But I mean, like, if you're at a DSA meeting and you take, let's say, what I would consider a moderate socialist position from the standpoint of a Marxist,
Hmm.
so you take a Marxist centrist position, which, you know, I would take a Marxist leftist position, right? Like, most people in the DSA would see you as on their left flank, and people who are more Democratic Party adjacent will definitely call you an ultra. What gets weird, is the whole post left thing,
Oh boy.
because this is one of those areas where, like, it seems like socialists now believe in their own form of horseshoe theory, where you'll hear, people call post leftist ultras. Um, I think it depends on who you're talking about.
Yeah, that doesn't
Um,
really. Yeah, definitely. You could see. I think there are some people who could be considered ultra in that kind of category, but that Venn diagram is it ain't a circle.
right. I actually agree with Grimlock that most of the post left is actually a socialist anti left. I don't think all of it is, because of also it's a very loose phraseology, but I do think a lot of it is. I would disagree with I know Grimlock, and we debate this all the time. I would
Mm.
disagree with Grimlock by how far it goes. There's some people probably in the chat right now that he thinks are anti-left, and I do not. But is post-left synonymous with class reductionist? Yes, but also no. So, I mean, I used
Well,
to go ahead,
I was gonna
Jeremy.
say a lot of class reductionist when you see the term flung around, a lot of it kind of like is. I mean, yeah, it's a term that suggests ideological leaning, but I think a lot of the usage that I've seen it just means asshole.
Right. People call people that when they don't like them, or they want to imply that they don't care about racial or gender issues, and some people don't.
Yeah.
Um, I actually called weirdly. I used to complain that class reductionists weren't class reductionists enough. Like, that's usually my problem. Like, if you're a diehard workerist, you actually do care about racial and gender issues, because, like, that's a contradiction within the working class. You need to help alleviate.
Yeah.
Like, it's not, um, it's not a position where, um, it, like, Doug Lane and I, for example, disagree on whether or not race and gender functionalities are solely a function of capital. He says of capital class relations. He says yes, and I say no. That I think that racial development happens concurrent but slightly before capital does, and actually means it's a slightly bigger, different problem. Well, bigger in a different way. I mean, it's a problem that you could have. You could start to deal with capitalist issues, and you might still have racialist ones. Um, so yeah, and yes, post left. Actually, I would say post left have three historically different definitions. Left communists used to consider themselves post leftist because they did not want to deal with anyone in the left of capital. They only wanted to deal with people who were to the left of other. So they were the left flank of communism. Um, so they didn't even consider people on the left flank of capital to be on the radar. So they would call themselves post left, being post capitalist left. Then there were the post-left anarchists in the 90s and early aughts. I mean, they're still around. And they range from primitivists to Bob Black's having a bad day. Bob Black and I used to, engage with each other online. And I remember he once he defriended me on Facebook and called me a Stalinist for saying that, like, there were hierarchies and some hunter-gatherer tribes, because there were. And apparently that made me a Stalinist. I didn't even say it was a good thing. I just said it was a thing. So there are some ultra positions. So, for example, is Jimmy Dore an ultra? By my definition, actually, no. He's an asshole, but he's not an ultra.
Right.
Like, his position with on the Democratic Party and on, like, a lot of the failures of the DSA is actually functionally identical to mine. What he wants behind it, I think, is actually very different. Like, far as I can tell, he wants a populist party. A left populist party as opposed to some Bannonite right one, but it's a populist party. And so to me, that's like green. That actually recapitulates the problems to bring this all the way back of Peter Camejo's endorsement and development of the Greens as the primary left party. Yeah, I mean, he's a very pissed off. I think he's an old progressive. He's very pissed off, and has some retrograde views. But I hate to say it, he's been calling a lot of the more popular members of the squad out on their crap. I do think he's been uncharitable to Ilhan Omar. So I'll just say that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're going to, as more and more people, I think for everybody to remember, as more and more people kind of get, as it becomes increasingly more tenable to have to make being a online leftist, like with your own show, that becomes a profession you can actually do. I think leftist media person, I think people need to separate leftist media people from leftist political figures, because there is, accruing a base versus accruing a membership are two entirely different things.
Very different things.
And accruing a viewership will cause you to do things that are counter to, say, increasing, more people to embrace basic empathy. You can be, for example.
Jeremy says basic empathy, and I'm like, more people to learn how to shoot a gun. No, so
you help each other learn how to shoot a gun.
Yes. Although I will, as a side note, I always tell people this before they misconstrue this. I don't carry a weapon because I have anger issues, and because I don't believe that I would kill anyone these days. And if you're not going to kill anyone, you shouldn't have a gun. Or if you're not willing to kill anyone, I'm saying if you're not like. But I'm old school like that. Yeah, you know what though? People have been weird about party and revolution since, I don't know, Bernie. Finding anyone online who understands power strategy is a frustrating exercise. Well, this is one thing I admire Chrisman for this point that he makes, although I kind of disagree with him. Chrisman's insistent that most of what we consider politics via Twitter, online, is not, and I think he's right about that. But then he'll like recapitulate politics as something completely outside of messaging in the media sphere or like conventional politics at all, and I think that's wrong. So he takes an initial impulse I think is true. Like, I don't think what I do proper on Varn blog or at Pop the Left or at Moral Science is political.
Yeah.
If I was going to be technical with it, I'd say it was pre or quasi political.
Right.
Oh, I don't think a lot of what I do in activist world, which during COVID has not been much more than mutual aid help and running logistics with my partner a little bit during the BLM protest to make sure people didn't get arrested. Mm-hmm. But during different times, we did a lot of work with protecting illegal immigrants who were being deported for like getting a traffic ticket in Mexico. So that was my big thing, because I have been an undocumented person. I said illegal immigrant. I was illegal in another country for 6 months of my life by no fault of my own, and so I really feel that. Yeah, well, I mean, this is what frustrates me about Dore. It's not that Dore exists. I'm kind of glad he does, but that other people should be doing this better, and not as a media personality. Because there are things that Dore says and does that at best is kind of early Gen X cultural norms that we should just like roll our eyes at grandpa, and at worst are actively like betray some stances that I don't even think Marx would have liked.
Yeah. That's the kicker about being a Gen X, or at least earlier Gen Xers, it was almost like a cohort, defining cohort thing of, because it was like this, it was always like this post 60s thing of like responding to the boomers. It became, kind of like you get some sort of like 90s, almost like nihilism about a lot of stuff.
Yeah, although I like 90s nihilism, trust me. But like I do think I think it is a generation with Bret Easton Ellis disease. So it's like it's got two major traumas, one of which is it came out of a very conservative milieu and was trying to shock it, and now like when people push back on that, they consider it conservative, and in some ways they're not wrong about that, to be honest. But it'd be hard to say it's conservative for good, for like progressive means, but I actually do think that. But two, they also grew up in a time where like I'm gathering this from my book on Christopher Lasch so much. Being a leftist in the 80s was dire. I mean, it was dire. For one thing, one of the reasons why that we often forget is like capitalist culture on stuff like sexuality actually seemed to be more progressive than a lot of the left did, because they were still holding like 40s USSR positions on, on homosexuality, on gender identification and stuff like that. Gen X has zero social capital. Yeah. Well, I mean, this is also we're going to see this with Zoomers too, and Zoomer nihilism does rhyme. I hate to tell millennials this, but they rhyme with boomers in a lot of ways they're not going to like. And I find it interesting because millennials in 2005 were predicted to be the most conservative generation, and I guess we were only spared that because of the recession.
Yeah. Those historical circumstances will, hit you like a bus.
Right. Yeah, Cockshot, as much as I think he's a reactionary now, was actually fairly progressive for someone coming out of the USSR. From an ML stan, yes. That doesn't mean he doesn't suck now. DDR had more progressive stance on gay issues than the CPUSA did. Yeah, I mean, yeah, we'll get in that. Do Occupy and SDS rhyme at all? They rhyme a lot, but the difference is the strategy. So the SDS comes out of like the SDS comes out of a radicalization of like SNCC strategies.
Yeah.
Whereas the Occupy comes out of a radicalization of the anti-globalization. I almost said anti-globalism because Alex Jones has ruined that for everybody. Anti-globalization movement. And I at the time, so you guys can, date me. My first experience in politics, really, in real politics, like not my first memory, my first participation, I wasn't even old enough to vote yet, was to travel the one time I went to Seattle in my life before 2015. Now I've been twice. Was to go to the Battle for Seattle with a bunch of my friends, and I saw Pat Buchanan speak there, which was weird. And I was really turned off by the chaos of it all. I'm not gonna lie. So okay, I gotta share this because this is funny. Turns out the dialectic was interested in millennials. That isn't what broke me of the left, though. What broke me of the left was International Answer and Sea Island, when the same anti-globalization process was supposed to happen in Georgia. And I went there, and International Answer like sent like a couple of weirdo. I don't know if the PSL had formally broken off from the WWP, but it was like those people. And this was a time where being a Marxist was a much more marginal position. So they were, and then like people around antiwar.com and the libertarian anti-war movement showed up, and they were so much more committed than the leftists I met there. And that's how I got pulled into that orbit. But Occupy, and I only saw Occupy Wall Street and Oakland on an academic trip when I was a professor. The 3 years of my life I was a full-time professor in Korea, actually. I come from Occupy Yoido, and Occupy Yoido was weird. So Occupy Yoido started off as a left-wing movement. It got endorsed by Kim Jong-un and immediately became a right-wing movement. It became an anti-U.S. Trade deal movement that was hyper-nationalist. And the left and liberal ends of it kind of went away. And so I went to contrast that, to go during Occupy, and actually this is when I formally joined Platypus Affiliated Society too. So, and I went to see my friend and my best friend in Oakland. We went through Occupy Oakland and saw a little bit. Then I took a bus to New York. By the way, that bus sucked. It was like 5 days on a Greyhound, but I got to see a lot of working class America. And then I went to Occupy. I went to the remnants of Occupy, of like people around Zuccotti Park and people hanging out in Brooklyn and Greenpoint, and met them there. And I was surprised how much it rhymed with the Battle for Seattle and how like triumphant people thought about it. But I remember thinking, this is the end of something, and some of it's going to be good because, like, I remember if you think about before Occupy, Alex Jones was trying to do the whole "I'm beyond left, right." Secretly, I'm so right wing. I don't like the right, but I can talk to ex members of Public Enemy, and left wing truthers, and that was very popular even during Occupy, and I felt like that was going to end. And I saw these new Marxist groups start to get their shit together. What surprised me was that the PSL benefited so much from it. Because a lot of the other groups that initially bloomed after Occupy, such as Kasama Project, they didn't last very long. They died pretty quickly.
I don't even remember, but yeah.
Yeah, Kasama Project was like it was like they left the RCP because the RCP maintained like anti-gay and anti-feminist and anti-religious policies like way, way, way longer than they should have. Like even than longer than Cuba did, Yeah,
sounds like some 60s holdover or some bullshit.
Yeah, it was. I mean, basically, Avakian just didn't want to modernize it until like the late aughts. So they left and started their own collective, I think around 2005. And they ended up mostly being an internet site, honestly, from what I can tell. They didn't try to go back and do the re-entering the factory thing. And it went about as well as you think it would. And they died as an organization pretty quickly thereafter. I think they were around for like 6 years. I don't know how big they ever were. Yeah.
Life in the dark time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah.
Did Alex Jones have? Did he talk to like Professor Griff or something? Or
yeah, he did. He talked to Professor Griff. He talked to Chomsky.
Of all the people from PE he would have talked to, would have been Griff. Yeah.
He talked to, but he was trying to do more of that whole. It's like just like Alex Coburn, or as I like to call him, Cockburn, was doing on Counterpunch that people try to ignore. Like there really was an attempt to get paleo conservatives and other non-establishment right-wing critics of the right, so to speak, in with leftists like libertarians and people like that. And that was Alex Coburn's strategy too. And it used to drive me up the wall because he would like kind of say nice, like Coburn said nice things about Le Pen, Marine Le Pen, not the really, really bad one, but still. What broke me on the left was hearing Clintonistas express contempt for impoverished rural areas in the West. The steel mill workers and the farmers basically were told to drop dead. Yeah. Yeah. Paul Craig Roberts is a great example of what that was. I considered myself part of that, like during the anti-war movement. Like I had no animosity towards leftists, but I was reading like American Conservative Magazine. What broke me of it was basically what broke millennials of it. The recession happened, although I realized that around 2005. So before the recession, I was like, this housing boom thing is weird. I bet it's going to burst. And then I started studying different economic theories that better explain what was going on. All the neoclassical people were wrong. Most of the Austrians were wrong, although not all of them. And then the Marxists were good. Little at the time, I didn't realize that Marxists always predict financial crash. It's sort of like their gig. But they had a better explanation to me. I started reading Marxism, and here we are today. So yeah, there's a better Le Pen. Not really, but there is a worse Le Pen. He's dead.
Good, he did die. Okay, cool.
Yeah,
I didn't know that, but good.
But yes, I mean, arguably, the betterness is just the other one figured out how to brand themselves better. Do I think the student left bubble will pop the way the housing bubble did? No, because it's secured by the government.
Yeah. Structure different.
Do I think it'll eventually become such a burden they'll do something about it? Yes, but only after it ruins a lot more lives. So does accelerationism work? No. Just answer that easy.
We just, in fact, on my show, we just interviewed somebody who wrote a book about a certain kind of acceleration, which was A.M. Gitlett's "I Want to Believe: Posadism, UFOs, and Apocalypse Communism," about Posadism and all of those. Well, I guess pretty much just Trotsky, kind of global South Trotskyism. Some of whom were much more openly advocating or desirous of, nuclear exchange than others.
Yeah, I mean, Andy was on the show too because you guys know I'm a trot and leftcom history nerd. Okay, I'm a history nerd, but Andy and I talked about this, and Andy has a slightly left catastrophist form of catastrophism. Like he thinks that mutual aid and all this will help, and I agree with him. But I tend to think you don't like. I think the burnout, even with the environment, is going to look weirder and be slower and be randomer than we think.
Yeah, definitely going to be randomer because who saw wildfires going not just in California but up, the entire West Coast being on fire last September.
I don't know. I know I've been writing a lot of poems about fires though.
Anyway, you're talking about Andy. Sorry to interrupt.
No, but Andy and I slightly disagree on that. But we were both trot nerding out about which trot tendencies were weirder and why they got that way. Mike Davis knew. Yeah, Mike Davis did know. Actually, I'll give him credit. Mike Davis is one of those Marxist geographers, and that I actually think makes a lot of sense. I won't mention the other one because I talked too much crap about him. But Jeremy knows who I'm talking about. Yeah. And so does Jason. That got me on Jason's show. Thoughts on time banking? Kinds of socialism.
Well, I mean, introduce the idea of labor tokens to some people or something. I don't know.
Yeah. So there's also many different theories of labor tokens. Like the most popular one is one that I think has underlying Marxist-Leninist assumptions in a way that this is me sounding like an ultra in a way that I think corrupts it, not as Paul Cockshots towards the new socialism, although it is fairly kind and democratic. I have been reading the Labor Token Man Tom O'Brien's request, Affles and the Communist Research Cluster from the 20s attempt to do it out, working out a labor token system with council communist assumptions. And we are working at the Emancipation Network to kind of conceptualize if it would be possible to do that with cybernetic inputs acting with labor tokens or as a proxy for labor tokens because they're more responsive.
Wait, one more time. Which were you reading? I think you burned that.
I burned past it. Let me actually. I'll actually probably because I can't remember its title exactly. So I'll actually find it real fast. This is. I will say when we're talking about ultras, this is considered an ultra text, but by Leninists. So. And it is the fundamental principles of communist production and distribution.
Okay, yeah, I've seen that title in some of the some of the podcast episode titles. So,
and it's by the group of international communists, mainly It seems to be bringing thought of this guy called Appel. And there's been a new translation of it that's out, unfortunately, for Ren Rat Books. I have historically been distrustful of labor tokens as a necessity of the 19th century that we may not need now, but we see.
I mean, we got smartphones and time banking. So what can we do with that?
We can do a lot with it. I mean, I'm trying to figure out a lot of the yeah. John Appel, thank you, E minor. I'm also reading on Nigerian communism. Someone brought up Nigeria because apparently Nigeria has somebody was telling me that the entire spectrum that existed in the West of communist thought actually kind of recapitulated itself organically in Nigerian communist, including ultras, including right deviationists, etc. And I'm going to read that and see like if it's people always like, oh, it's Western Marxism or whatever. But if it happened in Nigeria without the influence of Western Marxists being the primary reason, this might just be like a natural convergent thing that happens to this idea set. So yeah. By the way, I mean, I also will defend ultras needing to exist because they keep pragmatists honest until they blow them up. The problem that I like, so if I was to explain my position to people, I would say, I was joking, I would say I'm like socialist in the streets and a left com in the sheets, but like that's actually sort of, I'm a left com in theory, I'm an Austro-Marxist in praxis. So what does that mean? I work with social democrats on specific issues, and I work with social democrats personally. I will teach social democrats, and if we're under attack, I'll fight with social democrats. I won't join their party though, or their non-party church group or whatever. Jeremy's got you're on my show. You have to take my ribbon.
No, not every group with reading circles is a church group. Although we had a local member who wanted to host a reading group of Paul D'Amato's The Meaning of Marxism, which Kevin from the Regret of a Century also read that book in his formal organization. I think isn't
that an ISO book?
Yeah, I was gonna say I think he described it as Trot Bible Study.
Yeah. I won't say which organization it wasn't ISO. I was reading a Trot organization's introductory pamphlet for mortal science because we're doing this thing called WTF Marxism. Like we're trying to go through the various definitions, and I literally had a breakdown. Like Jeez. it was triggering, not like a crying, screaming breakdown, but I became like angry with everybody, like because the text was gaslighting me, and and was also doing stuff like making me deny my knowledge of physics and anthropology to become a Marxist and stuff like that. And I was like, no, this is weird. This is weird. It had a very creationist feel to it. And it felt weird because I'm like, why are you dying on that part of that interpretation of Marxism? Are you sorting for cultic idiocy? Like what is that about? But so yeah. Trot Bible Study, fun. It's what's interesting? How fast Trotskyism in America has collapsed. 10 years ago, if I was to meet a Marxist leftist, they were a Trotskyist. Almost inevitably. Even the WWP and a lot of groups that are anti-revisionist and MLs now have Trotskyists, are 1 degree removed from Trotskyist origins. Like, it's, the WWP was started by Sam Marcy, and I know that they've been scrubbing Sam Marcy's Wikipedia page, but he was a tanky Trot. He didn't leave Trotskyism.
That's an interesting combination.
What Morris Trot supported by the CAA? No. I've never seen evidence that now did the COINTELPRO have a lot of members in there? Yes, but COINTELPRO had a lot of members in the SWP. They had a lot of members in the CPUSA. They were like at least 3 of the leadership cadre of the RCP. Like they were all over the Panthers. They were crawling all over the Panthers.
Yeah.
But no, they weren't supported by the CIA any more than most of the Frankfurt School was, by the way. Because that's another myth that I get tired of hearing. Marcuse did take a job with the OSS after most of the rest of the Frankfurt School went back to Germany.
Questions from the chat. One of them is asking as a mathematician, what good mathy Marxist texts are out there?
Speaking of Frankfurt School people, although he was kind of kicked out, Henrik Grossman's but I forgot, it was the English version was first translated by one of my favorite Indian Trotskyists, Jairus Banerjee. Jairus, Jarius Benenaji, I think, or no, Baneji. But it's the accumulation and
the accumulation is something. If you enter it in, like search will autofill with the accumulation of something.
The Law of Accumulation and Breakdown of the Capitalist System, and it was published in America as the Law of Accumulation of the Capitalist System. They dropped the breakdown part, and it was only published in German in the United States, which is fun.
Interesting.
Banerjee, yeah. Thank you for correcting my. I would also another good mathy Marxist text, as much as he hates me personally, Andrew Kleiman's Defense of Marxism. What is it? I'll look that up too.
How can anyone hate you personally? You're so lovable.
Yeah, he hates me a lot. He has. If you look up my name by the second page, you'll find a polemic calling me a McCarthyist. So that's fun. Yes. Reclaiming Marxist Capital, a refutation of the myth of inconsistency. And in the same school, there have been 2 other texts that are useful. That talk about Marx on accounting math. Yeah. There needs to be. Also, I hate to say it, the analytic Marxists are good on math, but they have neoclassical. They try to reconcile neoclassical and Marxist assumptions, and that, like Romer's disproof of the tendency of the rate of the profit to fall is based on equilibrium assumptions, for example, which is not something even Keynesians believe in anymore. So it's it is what it is. Just so you know.
G.A. Cohen would qualify as
Breyer.
Okay,
go ahead, G.A. Cohen.
Oh no, would qualify as an analytic Marxist, wouldn't he?
Yeah.
Okay, because I think he's one of the ones that Ben supports a lot.
I don't love G.A. Cohen, but he's important. I bring up the great trader but very useful Adam Perwowski, and I think everyone in DSA should read that book in despair. It's his book on social democracy, and then on social democracy, because it game theories out a problem that has been historically held true. That most parties, if they want to stay in power and not be in permanent opposition mode, have to adopt coalitionary politics in a way that tends to undermine their socialist goals. What do I think of Aristide? I'm not a specialist in Aristide's situation. If Pascal was here, Pascal would answer your question.
Tune in tomorrow, Saturday from West Coast time. It's like 9 a.m. through for a while on the This Is Revolution YouTube stream, and Pascal will happily answer your question there.
Is Piketty worth reading? It's worth reading a summary of. I think
read a preface, not the whole damn book.
Yeah.
That word is.
I think there are some points that Piketty doesn't consider something. Piketty is like a left Keynesian. But I would say he does prove some things actually that Marxists have assumed but didn't have hard numbers for. You can actually get out of that book. One of the things is like the difference between wealth and income accumulation, which is like basic, but like you before Piketty made a big deal out of it, you would have thought no one ever thought about it before. The fact that that the growth of pre-modern modes of pre-modern economic systems was very, very low. Yeah. Thoughts on? I haven't read that.
I look at the page count of Piketty and just freak out. The real fun thing is somebody went into the Kindle numbers because I guess somewhere they report like Kindle amass or Amazon amasses just exactly how far people get into certain books, and I think something like overwhelmingly the distance that people got into Piketty's bestseller was like I think it's like less than a fourth. It's kind of at some point they get everybody goes along and then just stops dead because it's like they just give up.
It's kind of like when everybody was reading Nigerian Hart's Empire in the 90s or in the early aughts, and I don't think anyone actually read it until like 10 years later. Like,
is it still worth reading?
I think it's a cautionary tale because what Nigiri ends up doing through his influence of post-structural thought is turning autonomia into basically left populism. But I think they're interesting points. And it's dense and it doesn't need to be. Like it's one of those books that when I read it, I'm like, I could have read this in 100 pages, and it's like 400. But yeah. Kleiman has some good critic. I will say one of my things on the Kleiman on the book I mentioned about Kleiman, we've been trying to test out his math though, and we've just been unable to do so. So yeah. I haven't read Chatapaha. Yay. Sorry, I can't speak on that. I'm currently reading. I'm writing a Christopher Lash book, so I'm mostly reading history. And when I don't read for that, I'm reading what I have to read for a podcast, and then I read for fun. When I'd much rather read like medieval history or Gene Wolfe or religious history or something, than I would read a fifth or sixth Marxist text at a time. Because I do read the books for all the podcasts that I do. And you guys realize how many podcasts I do? Like, some days it's like 4 a week. Like, so I don't get to everything. I'm still trying to finish all my Samir Amin stuff when I'm done with this next book, so that I can. What I mean by populism, because it's class collaborationist in a bad way. The end.
Real quick, what Gene Wolfe book would you recommend people start with?
Fifth Head of Cerberus is where you're going to start.
Okay. Yeah. I think I have a copy of that somewhere. I don't think I've actually gotten around to it yet.
So populism, when I say populism, what I mean is a focus on class collaboration, usually between peasants, which don't exist anymore, and the working class. And so what it's come to mean is something that includes all but the very top tier petit bourgeois and the working class. And it's also... I tend to think it's also not aimed at anything but short-term amelioration. For all the fact modern populists love Christopher Lash, his first 2 books have like scathing critiques of populism in it. How do you read someone? I've told people this before. I don't sleep, you cowards.
You can't just flash the comment up there. You have to leave it. If you're addressing a comment, you have to leave it on the screen. Thank you.
See, Jeremy's coming in to make. He's always trying to make me professional, and it just never works.
Well, I want to raise your professionalism level to at least college radio.
Yeah. I was a college radio DJ, Jeremy. This is Jeremy and Derek story time. But you know what I would do on college radio?
What?
When I would get mad at my audience, I would put on Motorsbow and leave for an hour. Like,
I would if I came in for my shift like really angry about either. I mean, I was an engineering student for 6 years, so I was angry about a lot. I would do things like Coil covered Tainted Love, and they put it out as a 12-inch. Which is 45 RPM. I would play their cover of Tainted Love at 33 to third, which just sounds like a death march. And then just it's some point because my radio shows were always like 10 o'clock or midnight, so I was always in safe harbor. I would put Coil on and then immediately switch into like I found a record by a band called the Happy Flowers, and they had a song called why don't we what is it, why don't we eat the baby like the gerbils did, or something like that. Just like angry. And then eventually I would probably like segue into start playing like Big Black. And then by the time I got through playing Kerosene, I was usually feeling much better and could go on with the rest of the show.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, every Thursday I do a 2-hour show, and the second half of the show would be listener punishment hour, and it would vary. And if they really made me mad, it'd be Merzbow, or it would be like the deep cuts of bad Iron Maiden songs. So let's see. This is actually a substantive question. Were the Bolsheviks populist by that metric before 1928 and the bloodier bits of the Civil War? I would say no. However, what I will say is that they were put in a really precarious position because their actual base of their society, since the German Revolution didn't happen, was more peasant than proletariat, and there was no way around that. If you want to talk about an actual populist, I do think the Maoist line, the mass line Maoist, that is very, very close to modern populism. The thing that makes it different is I do think the Bolsheviks did put working class concerns first, and populist, it's not that strategic. Like, it's not like, I mean, so there you go. In autonomia and stuff like that, they thought that you had to deal with peasants too, because Italy had peasants as late as the 70s. But
Northern Italy or Southern Italy?
Southern Italy. Okay, but they were, they had a unified program, right? But that you didn't do it by catering to their interest explicitly. You did it by trying to ameliorate their incorporation of the proletariat, because their whole method of producing food was not efficient.
Yeah.
Someone else also punished their people with Merzbow. I'm literally insane. Read 3 books a week. I've slowed down on my book reading. I'm now down to like a book and a half a week. I want to destroy you, but I was listening to that today. So
I was very happy that the Soft Boys reformed and got all their stuff like reissued, and they would tour right after I got into them. So I got to see them play in like Detroit in like 2001 or so. It's great. If you haven't heard them, check out the Soft Boys album Underwater Moonlight. And the most famous Soft Boy was Robin Hitchcock.
Yeah. I love Robin Hitchcock by himself too. Ding was a populist. Agreed. So here's a question. If Trotsky had not lost to Jaruzelski in the war in Poland, do you think the German Revolution would have succeeded with Soviet support? That's hard to say because of how divided the SPD was with the KPD. And I don't know that wouldn't have instituted another civil war almost immediately, except unlike with the Mensheviks joining the whites, the SPD would have. Actually, when I say the Mensheviks joined the whites, by the way, not all of them did. Only about half of them did, or a little over half. But like the Mensheviks who did join the right, I suspect the right of the SPD would have joined the reaction just like the Mensheviks did, and they would have had more to fight with. But I don't know. It's hard to say. I don't like. I think if Trotsky had one, there would at least be more grounds for it to happen. Yes, you are noticing a theme. It should make DAnon happy. So Protestantism in the spirit of capitalism is also my only recommend, but the bunch of stuff on East Asia, I don't know. All right. Well, I gotta go hang out with I wasn't planning on going on today, and we actually didn't talk enough about ultras. Do I think ultraism is ultimately a problem? I think the problems that lead to what we call ultraism is more of a problem than ultraism itself. One of those is we need organizations that are left wing, but that deliver stuff to people and skill them on their own. And I'm going to admit that the complicatedness of technology in society does make that a infinitely larger task than it was in the 19th century. I would also want to give a shout out to give Mike to the wrong person. You've had me on like 5, 6 times. I usually come on once a year, right?
Yeah, once a year. I think the last time was the last time was it was a year ago, because I talked to you and one of the people I know who taught, because it was talking to teachers about education during COVID.
Oh yeah. I was doing the COVID education podcast. It wasn't just me. Yeah.
It was you and my sister, who is also a school teacher in North Carolina, and also my friend Melissa, who teaches ESL at a local community college.
Oh boy, sure. If the Vanguard Party is going to teach workers the code, then at least they'll be doing something useful for once. So
the modern Vanguard Party, of course, any modern Vanguard Party has to learn Airtable. So there's your coding.
What I will say, I am ambivalent about the notion of vanguardism, because I think the idea that just because people understand Marxism, their consciousness or whatever isn't distorted by their sectorial interest within capital is not true. But I also think if you don't have an educational apparatus to help people skill themselves, then you don't got anything. It's one of those things that I think it's a pretty serious issue. I'm going to be taking the weekend off because I'm on a stream tomorrow. If you guys want to talk EO Eric Olin Wright's Understanding Class, which is also an analytic Marxist text. It's one of the lesser shitty ones, in my humble opinion. Although its chapter on value theory makes me want to throw fire at a dead man.
Rest in power, Eric Olin Wright.
Yeah. You know what? What's really sad? It is nowhere near the last interview with him, but I did an interview with him with Amog Sahu for symptomatic redness before we got taken back over, before we were acquired peaceably by the loving arms of Doug Lane. When Doug and I signed our peace truce over the Great Hegel War of 2012. That's a real thing. So
I'm not doubting this thing for a second. I've been there in real life and seen the two of you talk like people remembering high school shit from 20 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that E.O. Wright text worth reading? Yes.
Yeah, totally worth reading.
I'm still in the first chapter, but that's just me.
But anyway, when that book first came out, I interviewed him with Amog because we were fascinated with it. Unfortunately, he actually accidentally turned me off the book because the way he explained it out loud was so complicated that it was almost not comprehensible. And then I read the book and I was like, damn it. But the sad thing is, I was in Mexico at the time. That's where I lived when we did the interview. And there's a lot of problems with it. My internet was not super great. Amog, I think, was back home in India, so his internet was not super great. And so we had all kinds of internet problems, and it took me a long time to edit it. And then my Mac died for good when I moved to Egypt. And so the podcast was lost, and there's no backup file anywhere. And so the one of my interview with Eric Olin Wright, which I can no longer do because unfortunately aging cancer took him, will never be heard and cannot be remade, sadly. So I try to pimp the book partly because, you know, that never got released. What I will say about that book, I think it's totally worth reading. I think it's really interesting. I will also say the chapter on labor theory of value is wrong, and leave it at that. No, I don't still have the drive. I don't still have the computer. It got left in Egypt. Like, I don't know if you guys know, when Trump took over, you couldn't fly with computers on planes in the Middle East. So I wasn't bringing a dead computer. I wasn't shipping a dead computer from Egypt to the United States off the chance of maybe salvaging one interview. I actually do have a backup drive somewhere that has like everything but that on it. I don't know why it doesn't have that on it though, because I've looked at the backup drive several times. I don't know why I'm telling you this much about my backup drive problem. You already know how professional I am. Like, Jeremy's fixing me on my own feed.
No comment.
You know, Jeremy, I finally have learned how to use the mic after being a podcaster for 10 years.
Sweet. Never never too late to learn. And just as long as you're not doing the thing where you're talking into an iPad and tapping your earbud cable like against the iPad to the point where it's clearly audible for the entire interview. So baby steps.
Oh, that's all I had in Egypt though, was an iPad and an earbud. But yes. Was that the first interview I did? Yeah, the first interview I did with you was in Egypt, right?
No, the first time you ever talked to me was November 2017.
Oh, so it was right after I got back. Yeah, I still only had an iPad.
Yeah, I was to say, folks, if you want to hear some fun archive, find our episode called Big Daddy Varn's Baby Leftist Primer, which you can find on soundcloud.com/giving the mic.
Yep. It's good stuff, except for apparently me tapping everything and moving around.
No, you were doing on that one. This was some like diet soap era Potomatic.
Oh yeah, all the early diet soap. Those are recorded when I'm in a foreign country and I had nothing to backup record on. Okay. We lost so many SRs that I try to give it. Esri XB used to be Symptomatic Redness's producer. That's I hired her because she used to do some side gig work for Partly Examined Life, which is how I got into the podcasting world. YouTube soundtracks are underrated, as you can see from a video that I won't list because the first 10 minutes of, or the first first minute and a half of it is silent. Yeah.
One of the modern cadre skills I would instill in modern leftists is how to make your own podcast, and I have given at least one talk to my DSA chapter about that.
So that's cool. Podcast suggestions. Since we're dropping out name, this is Revolution. Giving a mic to the wrong person. Of course, you can check out Zero Books. Who cares? You already know about that. Emancipation podcast stuff. Particularly, you guys need to listen to General Intellect Unit. All right, like, I'm not on that show. I'm gonna be on about education one day, probably. But Sectarian Review with Danny Anderson. It's a Christian podcast. I know it's weird, but they have me on all the time. And I'm not a Christian, so like at all. Let's see. What else would I say? I swept Secret History of Western Esotericism is great. Antifada is pretty cool, I guess.
Yep. Show and Jamie and Sean KB.
Give
them an argument, which is a YouTube podcast show.
Yeah, give him argument with Ben Budgers. Obviously, Ben and I go. I've been Dark Ben for a long time. We're almost the exact same age. We aren't born at the same time, but I've been yelling at Ben that he's that he's a Bernsteinist for I don't know 10 years. So
I would also recommend the Windy Muse's left POC, the Left Pocket Project podcast.
All right.
For reading Leftists of Color. There is my podcast app is just nothing but like, way too many. So I'm just kind of like flipping through here.
Well, it's funny because I don't actually. The joke about me is, I don't actually listen to that many leftist podcasts. I do listen to yours, but
thank you.
New
episode out. Huh?
Yep. The dig makes me mad, but sometimes productively so, as of today. So
yeah, they recently did another interview with Professor Olafumi Taiwo 2 months ago now, I think.
Yeah.
A good 2-hour interview that was really great that I heavily recommend. Oh, also, never forget Minion Death Cult, which is...
I don't listen to that.
What you do or do not?
I do not.
It is fun because it is two very funny Alexander and Tony. They kind of they do dramatic readings. It's sort of like the F+, except what they do is they kind of they go into Facebook group comment sections and kind of like document how insane modern day Facebook makes one's older relatives.
Yeah. Sometimes I like Trotsky and the Wild Orchids, which is a Trotskyist and a liberal fighting over stuff just because it's fun.
Yeah, there's Red Nation. Let's see, what else do we have?
There's Red Menace, Red Left Radio, which I don't mean to offend people. I think it's just a vastly uneven quality because Brett is too charitable as an interviewer, and I don't normally say that. But he doesn't push back on anybody. But I haven't listened to Red Menace. Dead Pundits is cool. Red Nation is cool. Dead Pundits has collapsed, kind of, sort of, sadly. I mean, Proctor's still doing stuff, but its Patreon has taken a major dip. Let's see here.
Yeah, there's Red Library. Yeah, it's the kicker is like there's now
too damn many.
Yeah, even listening at like 1.25 speed, you're not going to get through there because it's like there's only 168 hours in a week, folks.
And, right.
Like even if you want, like, say, Canadian leftist film podcast like Kino Lefter, it's just so much.
Our horror vanguard also. I mean, horror vanguard,
yeah.
Our faculty of horror. Actually, I could just list left-wing horror movie pods. Like, because I do listen to those, but it's I just wanted to give shout outs
also to the Regrettable Century.
Oh yeah, definitely anything on the network that's not Emancipation Network.
I don't remember what it is. I don't remember what the network. Maybe it's on here. Let's see.
Let's see. Because Red Library and From 78 are also part of that network, and they do network pods that are okay. I would say I would agree with People's Dispatch for international updates. I would also, dear God, BreadTube, I shoot you. No.
Also the Discourse podcast from Brandon Sutton / Pretty Bad Lefty and friends is funny, but occasionally, because they rip into what the Democrats are up to, it can get depressing too. But
wow. I would also tell people, I don't know, maybe actually read the news. I actually find a lot by reading not the main page of the New York Times or the editorial section. Dear God, do not read the editorial section by either liberals or conservatives. You might as well be reading, I don't know, National Review and Salon from 2013. Like, that's the quality of that editorial section. But
get coherency from the Washington Times.
I actually do read right wing news, and no non-right leftists. Oh, This is Revolution got mentioned. I also listen to Black Agenda Report. I also listen to
the left pocket, Wendy Muse's left pocket.
yeah. So we've mentioned at least 3.
Yeah.
So like I would say the deficits actually in female focused podcasts that are actually radical, because that deficit exists in reality.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that ideologically. It's just the overwhelmingly masculine tone of most radical political discourse groups is alienating to a lot of women. So yeah.
Yeah. Left Reckoning from Matt Leck and David Griscom. You have Hella Black, which is done by two young black organizers out of Oakland who do the Oakland Free Breakfast Program.
Antiwar.com has good survey international news. I actually say I actually do trust Antiwar and a few libertarian stuff for global news, probably even more than left stuff, sadly. Who else do I think is, I don't know. I will tell you guys one thing. Don't get sucked into a only left-wing media diet. Just like, I will say that's bad for you. I think Doomed by Matt Bender is interesting. I actually agree with you about that. I would also say Understanding the Enemy is okay, but I will say this: most people's understanding of reactionaryism is pretty thin, even when they go into it. Part of that is a deficit of being willing to empathize with people that you don't like, and part of that is I don't know. I think there's a miasma theory on the left that's bad. Why is the Panthers full of women, but radicals are disproportionately male today? You know what? You know what it is? Because radical discourse is different than radical organizing. When I work in radical organizing spaces, it's disproportionately female. When I work in radical discourse spaces, it's way disproportionately male. Or are queer and trans. There's a high representation of queer and trans. Part of that, I think, is because my theory on that is trans people in general have been so used to being not listened to that they don't get discouraged by it in the same way. They come out having to fight for that in their real life so much that fighting for it in a left space is not that big a difference. Where, I think it's a little bit different with other things there. After CBS is cool. I've now made a list of stuff that I'll listen to once, because I'm not giving up the rest of my I'm not giving up my 80s music podcast, which have nothing to do with the left. I will say, yeah, read Financial Times. It's better than The Economist. Read everything you can as far as news goes. And Reuters going to $35 a month is ridiculous, and I'm furious. But this is where we're at in the world.
Thanks for spending Friday night with us, folks.
Yep. Take care. Goodbye. Thank you, Jeremy, for coming on. Guys, I gave Jeremy 20 minutes notice. I was like, hey, Jeremy, I'm mad. I want to respond to this podcast you had me listen to. And I was like, do you want to come on? And Jeremy's like, I'm driving home from work. And I'm like, I can stall till you get here. All right. Bye, guys.
All right. Night, y'all.